I'm Jules Whale, and I have a life coaching practice in Salisbury. I've been just started making a series of podcasts because I really am keen to get out there what we can do for people, what offerings we have. And there's always so many questions that come out of this of what is going to be useful for somebody and what isn't going to be useful for somebody, and in different contexts. So today I've asked a friend and colleague of mine, Simon Matthias, to join me, and we're going to be chatting about the differences in what we do as a coach and psychotherapist, and the similarities, the crossovers that we have, and where we come together to work and where we would distinctly not work together. So welcome, Simon.
So I'm Simon Matthias, and I'm a psychotherapist, which means that I'm trained in particular types of approaches that work with people or groups. And I tend to specialize in working with adults who will have issues around depression or anxiety, and then also with children. And I have particular specialties within that. So if somebody has a question around ADHD, I can look at, assess, and work with those. But also, I think for me, one of the important things that I provide information, advice, and guidance to people who are asking questions about what we commonly call mental health, and maybe you're a little bit confused about the information that's out there. So that's roughly what I do.
That's really, really useful. Thank you, Simon. And I think when somebody is having troubles, having issues, I think it's really important that they understand the distinction of the nature of the help that they're looking for. I am an NLP life coach, so I practice really neuro-linguistic programming. And again, that isn't a medical thing. It's very, very much a mind thing. It's about communication. It's about improving communication with ourselves and other people. And sometimes we can have, when people come to me, we can have a crossover in their needs. We can have that they do have mental health issues. Now, when that happens, I then decide, am I really the best person to work with this potential client? Or would it be better to hand them across to my colleague, Simon? And I think this is a very, very important distinction. It's a very important thing to think about in this, as to what I'm able to do for somebody and what Simon is able to do for somebody, and how we do it. So for the benefit of the conversation, Simon, it would be really useful if you could just talk a little bit about some of the, as you refer to ADHD, which is, obviously something that you work with. I too work with people with ADHD, but that isn't usually why the person has come to me. So might it be interesting to unpack some of the things that people would come to you because of what's happened to them? If you could just maybe roll that out a little bit of somebody's struggling. So what would be a typical thing they're struggling with?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a difficult question, because for me, you have to work out what you mean by mental health in the first place. And in the background, in the media, and a commonality of understanding is that mental health is things like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, schizophrenia, self-harm, suicidal thoughts, those sorts of things. Now, somebody will classically come to see a psychotherapist for those reasons. That doesn't mean to say that what they present with, what we call their first presentation, is actually what the issue for them really is. It could be something else, because there are two thinkings around what mental health is. In the one school, it's mental health is an illness, a disease, and a disorder. And on the other side, mental health is about how we process things and how we interact with the world and how we cope with that and how we compensate for the slings and arrows that the world sends to us. I sit in the camp where it's more of a psychological processing thing. So I wouldn't say to somebody, you have a diagnosis of depression when you come to me. I would explore what their story is, what's happened to them, how they've got to where they've got, and what strengths and resources they've used to what we would call survive. And then have a conversation with them and explore what it is they're looking for to change the way that they presently behave. And it might be that they don't need to change the way they behave. What it means is they just need to understand how they do things, rather than just thinking that they are compared to somebody else and they are abnormal as opposed to the other person being normal. Because in the world of psychology and psychotherapy, there is no such thing as abnormality and normality. Classically, also, the person will have seen a doctor, a medical person, a physician, who will have made a diagnosis. And that's a whole different conversation. But they will have made a diagnosis, and maybe they want to see somebody in the private sector as opposed to the NHS services, which have restrictive practices, quite rightly, around what services they deliver and how they deliver them, and to whom. So I think coming to a psychotherapist, there is much, much more opportunity to access them, to work in many different ways that are much, much more person-centered or about the individual, rather than about the service that I've got to offer you.
That's yeah, that's really interesting. And I think going back, thank you. I think going back to what you first said about the first presentation, as you call it, I think this is where we do have crossovers, because when somebody comes to see me, quite often they have been diagnosed with ADHD, or they've been told that they've got some neurosis or something. And as we know, and this isn't by any means a criticism, the NHS is able to medicate much more cost effectively and time effectively than to actually go through these, these talking interventions that we offer. So I think when somebody does come to a coach or a psychotherapist, and I think it's very, very important to reassure people that if they came to me and it did, there was evidence of a mental health issue, that I would refer them on to you, and have done so.
And I think that's the interesting piece, isn't it? Is that the skills of yourself in terms of listening, having that confidential space, providing the time, the empathy, the development of an understanding of who that person is, who that client is, that psychotherapists also get trained in, are very, very common. They are the core skills that we have. We just have different approaches. And I think for some people who present with mental health issues, the most effective therapeutic intervention, the most effective thing we can do is just those core skills: to listen, give time, be empathic, and understand. And so somebody with depression can come and see you and actually get what they need very easily, very simply, without having to go through formality or rigmarole in terms of, oh, you've not trained as a psychotherapist or whatever, because the core skills are exactly the same. And I think that's a very important thing to recognize, is that how you do your work at a core level is the same as how I do my level. So both would benefit somebody with a classic medical presentation of depression.
That's really interesting. Thank you. My sort of response to that, if you will, is that with coaching, as we know, and I will be having a conversation with a counsellor as well, is very, very forward focused, and it is all about seeing myself, and we are going to go somewhere. We're going to be goal outcome led. That's not to say that we don't look back. That's not to say that we don't explore things that have happened. But my coaching way, as you say, is completely steeped in listening, active listening, positive active listening, and picking out the bits really that aren't being said mostly, and working with those. And I think a really important distinction here is that when somebody comes to me, I'm not saying as opposed to you, I'll ask you this in a minute, but when somebody comes to me into my coaching practice, I will ascertain fairly quickly what they want the outcome to be. So somebody will usually come because they want to change something, they want to better something, they want to improve, they want to leave stuff behind and move on. Now, it's not for me to create that goal. It's not for me to 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 decide how that's gonna, how that's gonna look at the end of it. But it's for me to actually elicit how we're gonna get there. So what does the client want? So I guess what I'm saying here is that when they come to you, quite often they have been recommended medically to come to you,
Mm.
which isn't the case with myself. So mine would be much more that somebody wants to change something about the way they're I say operating, the way they live, the way they do things, the way they feel, the way they think. With yourself, am I right in saying that somebody, more often than not, people will be referred to you?
A small number are referred. They often self-refer, having seen a physician in the first place. Um, I think one of the interesting things around that is that when you look at the psychotherapy and counselling world, there are over 400 different approaches, different types of way of doing, of being with the client. And I think whilst there is still some level of confusion over the distinction, the key distinction with psychotherapy is that we are predominantly very interested in the how the person got to where they are. So we are very interested in the past, in the developmental timeline from when they were born to where they are now. We're very interested in that. And with just going slightly off tangent, with children and youngsters, that's a very important thing to work with. The second thing is that we are predominantly interested in working with the unobvious factors that make us do what we do. So there are things in our what some people call unconscious, what some people call subconscious, what some people call out of awareness that make us do what we do. And those things that sit there very, very deeply are often based on that trajectory, on that path from birth to where we are now. And that's really what psychotherapy is really interested in. If I can put some sort of pathology around there are scars and scabs and all sorts of things that we pick up that need, to some extent, for the client to move forward, to be healed, changed, smoothed over, or understood. We can never change what happened in the past, but it might be that there is a different way of looking at it, which enables them to be more of the person that they would like to be. And I think that's really probably the biggest distinction between coaching and psychotherapy in a pure sense.
That's yeah, that's really interesting. I'm going to come back in there with the life path. I'm going to come back in there with the thoughts that are around scars and scabs,
Yeah.
and I won't go too deeply into it today, but I will say that NLP, the very, very basic premise of NLP in coaching, is that we can't change what's happened. So we're coming together on that.
Mm.
Another thought in NLP is that the big stuff that happens to us that affects our negative, unwarranted negative emotions happens before we're 7.
Mm.
So we're kind of bumping into each other on that as well, which is good.
Yeah.
So we are now melding into almost a sort of a choice of, who do you want to see, as opposed to much more of a distinct void difference that you would have thought there was before. There isn't.
Yeah,
I think that the one you've picked up on really, really succinctly is about working with youngsters and children, which I know some coaches do. I don't. And I work with adults. I work with adults that have got to where they've got to, however they've got there, and we unpick that.
Mm.
So I think your distinction, your sort of description of working with people that have got scars and scabs does actually marry up with what I do as well.
Yeah.
And that isn't so in all coaching. That is specifically in NLP coaching, which is what I do. So I'm really, really curious, and I know we've worked together in the past with discussions around family therapy, and I'd be interested to explore that a little bit if I'm working with somebody in a family, part of the family, and he or she is struggling and having their own issues that I'm working with. And then we find there's somebody else in the family that's got their own issues. When do you think that would be beneficial to bring you and I together to work as a team?
I think with families, if somebody, let's say, presents to yourself with depression, for example, let's stick to the mental health of depression. So if they come to you with depression, maybe they're on an antidepressant, just the one, and you're working with them and it works, but they're having relationship issues in the family. And it's a relationship issue that you've got a gut feeling around that you need another person on that seat. In other words, you need the other family member there. Well, as soon as you get to that point of you need another family member there, I think that's the point to start having a discussion about what's the impact across the whole family that particular person's behavior has, or the way that the rest of the family might have to go round eggshells, or the fact that some parent with depression, what we might call an absent other, may impact on an adolescent's development of their own identity between the ages of 13 and 17, for example. And it doesn't necessarily mean to say that you have to have Simon Matthias in the room with you, but having that discussion and conversation to enable and support you as the coach going in to do a family piece of work as opposed to an individual piece of work. Now, this is, I think, possibly one of the other distinctions in between psychotherapy and coaching, is that in psychotherapy, we are distinctly trained to work with groups and we're trained to work with individuals. So we do both. A family is a group. And there are times when we will do a piece of general family work, which might be called constellation, ego modeling, all sorts of different terms, to actually work out what role that person has in the family and is it fixed. And if that role is fixed in transaction analysis, which is my predominant training, it's called roll-lock, then that can impact negatively on the rest of the family behaviors and quality of life. Now, you can work with something of that nature through a third party, with a third party. So the relationship that you as a coach has with the presenting individual and then the family is never changed. It is only influenced through a psychotherapist working directly with you to support that. It may well then be of value in the conversation that you and I have, that it's worth being a part of that dynamic rather than being in that dynamic straight away. So I think there are a couple of things. It's about having the conversation initially, as soon as the gut feeling, as soon as the experience says, I think something else needs to happen here. And then as time progresses, how comfortable are you as a coach working in this more, what we will call systemic way with the family? And I think that for a lot of my colleagues in the psychotherapy world, that's not what they like to do. They like to remove the coach and work with the family. I think that's empirically wrong. I think it's because the relationship is with yourself. It is not with the psychotherapist. It is with the coach in this example.
That's really useful. And I think, I mean, we have had a situation where I was working with a client who had severe self-esteem issues, and her son was suicidal. And without going too much into it, I did actually refer the son to you. And I feel that by stepping back from, as you say, part of the family group, because whatever the mum and I achieved together was always going to be clouded by the lack of the son's ability to move on, the son's ability to be well. So I think this is really, really important part of this is working collaboratively with people that you trust, with people that you have built that sort of relationship with, and really knowing when to pass somebody along or when to involve them in that third party discussion. And I think it can be hugely beneficial. So I think for the message from this part of the conversation to any potential client is all about, if you are struggling and you're coming along to see me, and that's absolutely great, and yeah, great. If there is a constant pressure on you by somebody else in the family that isn't improving, then it really could reassure you that we can bring in whoever else we think we need to bring in order to improve the situation and to get the best results for everybody in the family.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very important one, because when people come to me, I will always explore, obviously, the family, what is going on in the family, because most of us have a family around us of some description, even if it's a colleague family or a work family. We have people around us, and they all have a huge impact on us.
Yeah.
So I think for me, working as a sort of as a coach, for me to understand the dynamic surrounding that person and to really, really discern when to get help in is going to be far more beneficial for that that person, that client.
And it's relatively innovative to be working together, with a coach or a counsellor on family-based issues. It is so much in the culture, in our therapeutic culture, to say, oh, it must be a family therapist, or it must be a systemic therapist, or it must be a this. No, it doesn't, because I think, again, fundamentally, that the way we get through the stuff of life is by the relationship that we have with the individual first. Once that's once the rapport, the relationship is there, the process of making the change that is required, driven by the client, becomes much easier. If I then come in, or if a counsellor or psychotherapist comes in, then there's a change in that relationship. It's almost as though you're rebuilding again, when at the majority of levels, it is fundamentally important that the coach stays as the single point of contact and the person that supports and does the work. Clearly, they can come back, as I do, and I know we've spoken about this as well. I can't practice without having supervision. It's part of how we make sure we've got good quality processes and working in, and that we're doing the job for which we're trained for to do. So in a sense, it's like having a third eye, a third voice, a third person to support the family, because that's what it's about. And I think more of that type of work could be done. And just as a side, if you think of another type of medical diagnosis called personality disorder. So personality disorders are very, very difficult to work with within the National Health Service. And predominantly what happens is you set up a family unit for people with personality disorders in the main. And when you do group sessions, you will almost always have two people in that session. One might be an occupational therapist, the other might be a psychotherapist or psychologist or whatever. But there's always two people in there, because they know that there will always be another perspective and another way of supporting that client. But it is always driven through the lead for that group. And it can only be driven through the lead for the group, because that's where the strongest relationship is, to make the biggest change that the client is looking for and needs and wants to do. Yeah.
Thank you. I think the other thing that I really do want to really explore today is, and I know we know each other, and we have sort of had discussions around coaching, counselling, psychotherapy, and everything connected.
Yeah.
But for me, as a coach who isn't medically trained, I don't have people referred to me through the NHS, which I know you have had,
Yeah.
and I know you do. But for me to work with you is great for me, and I think it's brought something to you as well. I know we had a talk about a while ago about values, of which I will talk about on another day. But I did a masterclass in values, and I know you were there, and you said, "Do you know what? I could use that. I can use this in what I'm doing as well."
Yeah.
So I think by our communications and mutual support, it can only benefit anybody that's coming to see either one of us.
Yeah.
Because we haven't got closed minds. We have this conversation around, well, that could be really useful in what I do. And I've spoken to you several times about clients that have come to me with personality issues, disorder.
Yeah.
And I think that is a reassurance to anybody. I like to think it's a reassurance to anybody that they're going to get the best outcome from either the best person for the job or a collaboration of the best people for the job.
There must be, and this is one of the things, go back to my values, this is really, really important. There's got to be a collaborative working relationship between coaches, counsellors and psychotherapists. I said earlier, there are over 400 different approaches in the psychotherapy and the counselling world, which says that not every approach and every technique is right for everybody. There's a whole pick and mix out there. And I think if you become quite narrow-minded as a psychotherapist, just on your particular approach, you can miss an awful lot of ways of working, of supporting a client who wants to make a change, but actually doesn't understand what the heck you're talking about. And I know I shout about this a lot. The approach that a psychotherapist is trained in has nothing to do with the client whatsoever. The approach is for the psychotherapist to understand what is in front of them. It is a model of understanding. It is not for me to teach my clients or to teach people I work with, like yourself, what my model is. I'm not trying to re-educate you. I'm just working with you to say, oh, here's a different perspective. Here's another way of looking at it. Actually, in my model of whatever it is I deliver against, this is how we see it. Have you thought about this? It is not to say that my model is the best model. It is just to help me understand who and what is in front of me, not to change the person to fit my particular thing. I suppose the classic thing is it's not about trying to put a square peg in a round hole. I don't know if that's the right metaphor, but I'm very adamant that any therapist, psychotherapist, counselor, whatever you want to call yourself, if you try and teach your client your model, you are making a fundamental error in supporting your client. And it's the same when we work together with coaches or with other psychotherapists or counselors. It is about working together to understand in different ways that then can help that client move in the direction that they want to move, rather than squeezed into something.
And again, that is a very, very interesting distinction, because you just said about the different model of the world. And again, going back to my NLP staff, we fundamentally believe that everybody has a different model of the world, and it's not for us to it's for us to respect it. It's not for us to necessarily understand it, but it's for us to respect it. So when somebody would come to me for coaching, whatever they tell me, whatever they want to do, however they want to do it, is their map of the world, is what they want to do. And my job is not to question that. My job is to enable them to question it. My job is to enable them to explore it.
This is where I would come back and I'd say, yeah, I sort of agree with you. I sort of disagree with you, as I often say. I absolutely agree. Everybody has an individual map of the world. And I map of the world, I call it frame of reference, roughly the same thing. I would also go further than that and say everybody has a frame of reference or a map of the world, which is also situation led. So, for example, one of the things that I'm looking at the moment is I can have a client in front of me that will describe a particular map of the world in a particular situation, and they behave in a particular way. I then say to them, so what do you behave like at home? Oh, it's different at home. I do this. So that must represent a different map of the world. So for me, I don't think it is I have a map of the world or I have a frame of reference. I have many frames of references. And if you like, I guess here's another metaphor I might use. If you think of a feather has a central core to it. And thinking about development, child development through to adulthood, we develop the core map of the world, like the center of a feather, that hard quill-like bit. And then off the feather come these, I don't know what they're called fronds, but these individual pieces. And I think that we individually have different maps of the world or frames of reference for different situations. So as a child, I know how to play mummy off against granny, or dad off against mum, because I know that they are different. So I must have a different frame of reference to help me understand how I should be with them. And I take that further as in school, etc., and Cubs and Scouts and ACF. And then when I grow up, I have all of these. And somebody who might present classically with a medical definition of depression might have a frame of reference that they are depressed. That's their core piece, that's their core quill, because that's been part of their life history, their life narrative. And yet when they're in playing football, they're not depressed. So their frame of reference isn't about being depressed when they're playing football, but they come away from playing football, they come back home where there's girlfriend, dog, fish, and they're depressed. So their frame of reference sits around something else being different. So for me, they can't have the same. Now, is that the same in NLP? Do you think that people have?
I do. I think from what you've touched upon there is very, very similar to the train of thought in NLP, whereby we have ways we like to receive communication and ways we give communication. And in as much as that, if you have a situation where somebody is struggling with something, what we will do is we will look at a time when they weren't. And we will take all of the communications in that. So, for example, if I said to you, think of a time when you were feeling really, if you came to me with anxiety, and I would say to you, Simon, think of a time when you weren't feeling anxious, you were at the top of your game. And you might say, oh yeah, when I achieved something. And I would say to you, okay, so talk me through that. What could you see there? What could you hear? What were you feeling? And you completely build that picture in your mind of where you were, what you were doing, who you were with, and how marvelous you felt. And we map that across. So if you used your analogy of a game of football, so you said about having a game of football and they're not acting like that, it's very similar. Because if somebody isn't doing anxiety, if they aren't doing lack of self-esteem when they're playing a game of football or they're doing so, that's where they're going to go. That's where I will take them to. And that's where we will then take all of the feelings surrounded in that, all of the feelings contained in that. And we will model it across, we will map it across to a situation. And it completely and utterly confuses the mind. Mind is very easy to confuse, isn't it? And you see a look of disbelief come across their face. If they say, well, I should be feeling rubbish when I'm doing this presentation, but actually I'm feeling great because I've just heard the goalie's whistle and there's people clapping around me and I'm feeling at the top of my game. So there's actually a crossover there as well in the thinking that you have and the thinking that NLP practitioners have, which is really interesting. So yes, the map you're saying frame of reference changes. I don't disagree with that. What I say is that we can always find a good frame of reference and we can always map it across. And that is a really, really powerful procedure, powerful process, and it works.
Yeah, and again, I think there were two interesting things there for me. One is about it works, and for me it goes back to this idea of what is your approach to working with somebody. So yours is NLP, mine is predominantly transactional analysis as a psychotherapeutic intervention. If the worker, the coach, the psychotherapist is really good at what they do and they work with the approach there and they've got a good relationship, then that will help. Because I think the skilled practitioner is able to adapt and flex how they work within the approach. So it's not a rigid, I'm going to apply this model, end of, and you will obey. It is, we're flexible and adaptable with the model that we got to suit how the client wants to work. I think that is really important. The other interesting thing you said doing anxiety, or which is a really interesting thing, because I've been trying to search for what do we call this idea of mental health. As when we say mental health, we tend to have a negative association with it. We tend to think of illness, disorder, disease, drugs, etc. But actually, it's the mind is a concept. It's not a solid object. The brain is the solid object. The mind is something we've created to try and explore and explain. And the doing piece, the behavior piece, is what we actually see. So I, observing somebody else, will see them doing anxiety. Maybe they're jittery, maybe they're rubbing their hands, maybe there's low level of eye contact. And the same when you talked, you also said about doing self-esteem. And I think that's a really good description. People do what I'm going to call their compensatory and coping mechanisms, or to put it really deeply clinical, they do their survival or threat response activities for what goes on in their life in the world. So, I have my threat response to a new situation is anxiety based. I know that. That's fine. I like to do a good job. I like to make sure it's perfect. I like to, and that's based on my history. But I do anxiety based bits when I'm coming into a new situation, or I've got to start a new piece of work, or whatever. And one of
I
my
think that if I can just come in there,
yeah,
one of the benefits of using the term, how do you do your anxiety, how do you do your lack of self-esteem, is it's giving the person permission to understand, and maybe sometimes for the first time ever, realize and believe that that isn't the whole them.
mm,
They say, I'm an anxious person, I'm a depressive, I'm a I've always had this, I've always had that, I've been told.
yes,
So what we do as skilled NLP practitioners is we remove that, and we we say, well, how do you do that? How do you do your phobia? How do you do your anxiety? And they say, well, I don't know. So then we explore that, and they do know. And when you actually feed it back to the person as a coping mechanism, because the things that they do will be the coping mechanism, hand washing, or not wanting to go out,
mm,
eating too much, eating too little, all of these sort of things. When you actually give that back to the person, it normalizes them. Sometimes they haven't been feeling normal for a long time, and I use the word normal, but as I say, people around them have usually said, "What's the matter with you?" That isn't normal. We use the word normal a lot. I mean, we're now into the new normal this year. I don't know what the new normal is, but I think for me to say, "How do you do your anxiety?" really is a relief to a lot of people, because it's then taking away that responsibility. It's a big responsibility carrying around anxiety. It's a big responsibility. You have to keep maintaining it all the time. You have to feed it.
yes,
And it's just, it's very, very deep. I get that. But a lot of people, when they come to me and I say, and I do say it, well, how do you do that then? They say, what do you mean, how do I do it? I am that. Well, no, you're not that. You're not just that. You're a teacher, or you're a mum, you're a dad, you're whatever.
yeah,
You're not just anxious. That's not your name, is it? You're not. So to me, by saying, how do you do it? It's become a really, really useful form of communication with people. And I think that lightens it. I think it makes it a lot easier for people to understand it, and to start a little bit of self-analysis. Well, how do I do it? And then we start to move forward with understanding our own responses to situations.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got if you label, then not only might I, if I've got a label of anxiety, I might not only live up, enact anxiety, but if people know that I do these things, they will see them as anxiety-based behaviors, and they're not. It's a medical term. It's a medicalization of a normal human response to a situation that they're in. We're humans. We're social. We're designed to survive, and we create ways of doing survival. And anxiety is a way of doing survival. Hearing voices is a way of doing survival. Um, but in the background, our culture, our socioeconomic has said, "Oh, that's anxiety," and therefore, and we've lost that piece to say, as you say, what's it like doing it for you, as we might say, what's happened to you. And I think that's another distinction, isn't it? Because I guess from briefly what we're saying here in our conversation is that I would ask what's happened to you as maybe a first question, but it sounds as though your first question is slightly different.
Mm.
And that's another distinction for where our work separates slightly. And I think also one of the other ways of looking at it is the impact of the doing on that person. So if I may take two very light examples here. So if a child doesn't have a good enough attachment, as an adult, they won't they're likely not to form relationships very well. But that can be worked through to create what we call earned security. In that situation, to work with somebody to enable them to build good relationships with somebody else, work, intimate relationships, social relationships, they can work with yourself very, very easily. And I'll be honest, probably better than if they work with a psychotherapist. Yeah? And that's great. If you take somebody whose behaviors are impacting quite immensely on their overall physical and mental health and well-being, let's say eating disorders, or the state of depression is so intransigent, they are self-harm, they come unkempt, you start to see drink, gambling, all the associations. That to me is the time that a coach should be saying, that's a psychotherapist issue. That is not a coach issue. Because I can work with the attachment piece, but I think the better results come from yourself as a coach. But in terms of the self-harm, the self-harming, self-injurious aspect that depressions and anxiety disorders can bring, and the whole range of what we call it can bring, I think may be better addressed by a psychotherapist.
I agree, Simon, and I think this is where, I stress the point again about reassurance of when to go to see an NLP coach and when to go and see a psychotherapist. And I think that is an important distinction. I think for the purpose of the conversation today, and I hope it's cleared up some people's thoughts on it, is actually I can choose who I go and see to a degree.
Yes.
I can get good results from either.
Yep.
And when we say results, as I say, mine's always outcome focused. What do you want to be happening? How do you want to be? And then I coach on from there. So I think because NLP and psychotherapy do have some, they do definitely have some paths crossing here. I think that can only be a good thing to offer people different choices, and to know and to know that if they went to either one, either you or myself, and we felt the other one would benefit them better, that they would be, referred on and recommended to go and see either or.
This is where we get into that area of trying to be quite distinctive. So, for example, there are a number of presentations that somebody might have. So if you think of if I'm depressed and I've been on one medication and it's within the first 5 or 6 months, then there is no reason why somebody cannot go and see a coach and that coach be able to work well with them, providing the coach is okay with working with somebody who's on an antidepressant. Yeah? That's one important thing. If the person is depressed, they're flipping their medication, so they've been on one and then they've gone to another and they've gone to another, or they're depressed and they show another symptom, what we call a symptom. So maybe they are doing some skin picking, maybe they are grossly lethargic, maybe they've lost a job at the same time. That's the time to go, this is a really grey area. I would rather this person see a psychotherapist than see a coach. If they've been flipping their medication, they are drinking, and it's the cumulative effect. It's the number of extra bits and pieces that they have on top of their depression that makes it important. There's a new thing out called the power, threat, meaning framework. And one of the cool things it says in there is that the greater number of coping strategies you have built that are obvious, such as the depression, such as the alcohol, such as the self-harm, the injury, the overactivity. So you might find somebody who's depressed and running all the time. They're running 5 days a week, 20 miles and twice a day. That person has presentations that are probably best set with a psychotherapist than a coach.
I agree, and I think well said, Simon. I think for me, as a coach, my work is all around exploring possibility, exploring what's holding us back. We want to do something, or we don't want to do something anymore. What's stopping us from doing that? I do see clients who are on antidepressants. I think a lot of people are on antidepressants, so that wouldn't stop me from seeing a client. However, if a client is heavily medicated, they have a history of self-harm, they have a history of compulsion in habit, I would not coach that person. I would pass them on to a psychotherapist.
Sure.
So there is a distinct difference here of yours. In very simple terms, I see as more of maybe a medicalized approach, and mine, I believe, is more of a self-development, a want to improve and achieve things and move on. And yeah, as I said before, what's stopping me from doing that? So if somebody does come to me and they have self-harmed in the past, if that is in the past and it isn't present, then that would not prohibit me from working with somebody. So I wouldn't want people to think that it would. However, if they are in the middle of a turmoil of self-harm, as you say, drinking too much, drug use, I would not work with that person until they'd moved through that with yourself and a psychotherapist, and they were then in a place where they wanted to then start achieving goals, start changing certain things about their life. So I think there's a distinct difference there.
Yeah, I mean, there is another model to think about, isn't there? We think about if you think broadly about psychology, you have psychology itself, the understanding of human behavior through brain and mind interaction. You have the psychotherapy counseling world, which is an intervention around supporting what historically we've always called better mental health, whatever that is. And then we've had a growth of coaching, which is come from a stem of I'm good at what I do, how can I be better? So performance enhancement, if you like, for want of a better phrase. And within a lot of coaching models, in my understanding, and NLP as being one of them, is that gone out and looked at what's around there and taken the best bits and created something based on their research and development, both in what works well and new theories, interventions, and modelings, and that's worked. I think the other piece to bring in here is probably the behaviour change movement. The very the behaviour change is about I want to change something that's relatively easy to change. That may not be the right phrase, but it's the way of saying that actually I'm doing something now that I don't want to do and therefore must stop, or I want to do a different behavior that's more beneficial to me. And that type of behavior change where I want to better my performance, I want to stop doing this, I need to be doing that, or I want to do that, I think is closer to a coaching model than it is to a psychotherapy model. Because I want to go back as a psychotherapist and explore very deeply why it is you're doing this now. So if somebody comes to me who is depressed, what has happened to you? Yes, I've had depression. Okay, tell me when you've had other things that are very similar to the depression you've got now. So what might have caused that? And how can we prevent that going forward? So for me, there's quite an important distinction that if somebody has a medical diagnosis, and I hate the term, but if somebody has a medical diagnosis of a mental health disorder, illness, or disease within that model, then I think they are better off seeing a psychotherapist than they are a coach. Now, here's my caveat to that. There are certain coaches who are better, more professional in my scrutiny than others. And so the coach that is more professional and better at will know their limitations and know what they don't want to deal with because it's out of their skill set or experience base. There are those out there that don't, and they are the ones that when you have a gross mental health presentation that can do more harm than good. And I guess that's why psychotherapists and psychologists sometimes get a little bit angst about the coaching fraternity. But if you think of simple behavior change, coaching, they are very skilled models and very skilled practitioners of being able to support somebody. As Jules said, I want to see what you are like today and where do you want to go? How do you want to move that forward? So quite visionary, quite goal set, quite instantly benefit orientated to the future and beyond. Whereas psychotherapy needs to understand a little bit more about what's happened to you. Because some of the behaviors are what is being called threat responses for you to survive. So hearing voices is a threat response to survival. It is not a mental health disorder. So if a coach is sitting somebody in front of somebody who hears voices, and that's the only presentation, I would still argue that that person needs to come and see a psychotherapist rather than sit with a coach.
And I think that thank you, Simon. I think the distinction you made there was each of us knowing where we want to be, where we should be, and what is going to benefit the client. And I think that is the important important distinction in this,
Yeah.
to me.
I ask this question then. If a client comes to you and they are they're completely unsure of what they want, what's gone on, why they're there, is that a client you would work with, or is that a client you might think they seem to have some chaotic nature to their thinking processes, which might say, do you know what, I think they're probably better off somewhere else? And I ask the question because one of the fundamental distinctions, I think, between a counselor and a coach and a psychotherapist is that the majority of time, the psychotherapist is very, very, very comfortable with the ambiguity, the unknown, and the uncertain of the client.
So the question you asked is if somebody comes to me and they are presenting in a certain way.
Yeah.
Okay. What I would say to that is that before that person has come to me, we're going to be having a conversation as to why they feel they need to come to me. So that in that initial conversation, all of the key words, if you like, are being picked out at that point. So the person might say something like, my family have said I'm doing this, or I've noticed that I've been doing that.
Yeah.
And I would then say, so why now? What's happening now that you want to come and see a coach? And invariably, it's all about, well, I'm fed up with doing this. I want to do something different. I want to, but it isn't. This is very, very important to really, really stress this. That if somebody comes to me and they are chaotic in thinking, they are clearly they've got history, maybe of self-harm or self-abuse. I would very, very quickly suggest that that then my style of coaching is not suited to them. So that would be.
That's also a really useful distinction, isn't it? Because whilst we talk about coaching and psychotherapy and counselling, there are, we have a particular way of delivering that, of working with that. And there are certain categories of clients that are not suited to how I work, or because of the way I work, there are certain categories of clients that are best suited to seeing somebody else. That it's just not going to work for them. It's not going to work for me. So in the pre-selection process that we have, when somebody rings up, are there key things that would say this is a client for somebody else, or this is genuinely a client that I could work with?
This is absolutely at that point of contact. The questions that are asked are obviously intelligent questions, and they are questions that are designed to elicit whether that person is going to get the best from me and what I can give them. And this is absolutely vital to stress. Am I going to be the best person for them? So in that initial contact, that's when we decide, am I going to be the best person? Now, leading on from that a little bit, I've just actually I've just got a new client who was referred to me by somebody. They have been working with this person for a while, and the person can't move forward because their self-confidence and anxiety is getting in the way. So I've just been referred somebody by somebody else who really now wants to move forward. So that is the distinction. It's a positive, I'm feeling rubbish. I've gone as far as I can with that other person, but I just want to move forward now.
Mm.
So it's very, very important as a point of reassurance that, when you do contact a professional coach, a highly trained professional coach, um, that they will discern who they can and can't help, and who they want to work with and who they don't want to work
Yeah, I mean, I had somebody contact me the other week, and I've seen them this week, and they want an assessment for ADHD, um, which is possible. And I explained to them the way I work, and they have then made a decision as to whether I'm the right person for them or not. So I've left the decision with them.
with. I think that can only be a good thing, to offer people different choices, and to know that if they went to either one, either you or myself, and we felt the other one would benefit them better, that they would be, referred on and recommended to go and see either or. But thank you for that conversation.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
I
Thank you for
enjoyed it.
asking me.
Thank you, Simon.
There is still a stigma about going to a psychotherapist or a counsellor. Let's not get away with that. We tend to think that psychotherapists and counsellors are all for negative stuff. Well, actually, they're not. They can be very beneficial for good stuff. But there is a clear distinction on about if somebody is wanting to reflect more about where they've got to how they've got, that might be a distinction for seeing a psychotherapist as maybe a coach, where they're going, I want to change and I want to move forward. So it's almost as though there's looking back at the past and reflecting on the past is psychotherapy. Moving forward is counselling, and there still is that grey area in the middle, the crossover area, for which counselling or psychotherapy or coaching would be beneficial. And it's in that grey area that it's up to the professionalism of the psychotherapist and the coach to go, actually, I need to help you as a client make the right decision to work out whether I'm the right person for you or you should be seeing a different professional.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for speaking with me today.
Hello, thank you.
Thank you for coming along. If you could just start by briefly introducing who you are and outline what you do, that would be really useful for the listener.
Sure, thank you.